Syrian wing, seized power, and in 1966, the radical left wing of that party, led by a man named Salah Jadid, staged a coup and set about to create what it called a workers' and peasants' government. It was actually the left wing of the party, both in Syria and Iraq, was then to the left of the Communist Party in what it was seeking to do. And Syria was then strongly allied with the Soviet Union, and in Washington was being referred to commonly as, quote, the Cuba of the Middle East. In June 1967, Israel launched the surprise attack that Salma referred to on Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, destroying their air forces and their military capacity very quickly, with the full backing of the United States. In addition to the West Bank and Gaza, Israel took over the Syrian Golan Heights, driving out more than 90,000 Syrians and bulldozing many Syrian villages and the main city of Golan, which was called Quneitra. The next month, Israeli settlers began moving into this agriculturally rich area, which was later annexed illegally to Israel and remains so today. The impact of the defeat of the 1967 war weakened the position of the Jadid left wing and the anti-imperialist movement in the region. And this is another, just one example of could really be hundreds of examples of not only the overall imperialist distorting influence on the region, but specifically the distorting influence that Israel has had as an extension of imperialism in the region. In 1970, when Palestinian refugees comprised a majority of the population of Jordan, they rose up against the CIA agent King Hussein. That's not, by the way, rhetoric. He was a CIA. He was on the CIA payroll for decades. The Jadid government sent Syrian armored forces across the border to support the Palestinians, but the Syrian Air Force, led by Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, refused to provide air cover, and the Syrians were forced to retreat. The Palestinian uprising was crushed. More than 15,000 Palestinians were killed, and they were forced to withdraw because the Jordanian Air Force, provided to the King Hussein by the United States, and the Israeli Air Force, the Jordanian Air Force actually carried out the attacks, and the Israeli Air Force threatened that if the Jordanian Air Force couldn't do it, they would come in and do the job. And Hafiz al-Assad, as the chief of the Syrian Air Force, held back. 2 months later, and this again further weakened the Jadid forces, and 2 months later Hafiz al-Assad seized power, ushering in a much more centrist government than had existed before. And over the next 30 years, the Hafiz al-Assad government would play a contradictory role, at times opposing and at other times collaborating with both imperialism and the Palestinian liberation movement. Because Syria continued to host many of the Palestinian resistance organizations' headquarters, the U.S. continued to keep it on its list of so-called terrorist states. And also because, despite the fact that while at some time the Hafiz al-Assad government collaborated with the U.S., it was never a client state, like, say, the Sadat and Mubarak regimes, or King Hussein, or others. After his death in 2000, the Ba'ath Party leadership selected his son, Bashar al-Assad, as his successor as president. And that's also, I think, just want to mention it because it's not like he just decided before he died, oh, my son will be the leader. That was a decision of a party leadership for whatever the reasons, and we could talk about that. On April 10th, 2003, the day after the fall of Baghdad to U.S. forces, a top U.S. official, John Bolton, told the media that, quote, Syria, Iran, and North Korea should learn the lesson of Iraq. And that's quite a lesson, isn't it? If you don't do what we want you to do, we'll starve your population, kill your children, destroy your society, invade and bomb you, destroy your infrastructure. I mean, talk about terrorist threats. 2 years later, the U.S. in 2005, together with France, the former colonizing power, and pro-imperialist forces in Lebanon, launched a major campaign to bring about regime change in both Lebanon and Syria. And this started with the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri. the prime minister and the richest man in Lebanon, and the accusation that it was Syria that was behind this. I was in Syria a few months later in 2005, and when on the day that the United Nations report was supposed to come out about the Hariri assassination, or the day before it was supposed to come out, another Lebanese politician was assassinated, was blown up by a huge bomb. And the U.S. Officials immediately said Syria was responsible. I mean, you could hardly imagine a stupider thing than any government would do on the day before a report is due about them, about an earlier assassination, to carry out another one. I mean, it was just, it was ludicrous. It was a ludicrous concept. And it was only that the escalating resistance in Iraq and the growing strength of the popular movement in Lebanon that forced the U.S. and France and to back off temporarily on their regime change plans at that time for Syria. Once the Arab Spring rebellions began, the U.S. worked feverishly to turn the events in favor of their interest. They've tried to manage the outcome of the uprisings, the revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, and Yemen, which all had pro-imperialist regimes, while supporting upheavals against governments that it regarded as too independent from Washington's dictates. The U.S. did not initiate the rebellion in Syria. There were diverse and long-standing grievances against the government, and anyone who visited Syria for any period of time would, and talked with people would know that. And many of them were legitimate grievances. But once the demonstrations began, the U.S. position was immediately clear. While the Obama administration supported the violent suppression of the demonstrations in Bahrain, Yemen, and initially, we should not forget, in Egypt as well, they posed as defenders of human rights in regard to the suppression of protests in Libya and Syria. In the case of Libya, this very soon turned into a NATO bombing war, which after several months overthrew the Gaddafi government. And it's very clear to anyone who has any objective view that that was the only way that it was possible to overthrow the Gaddafi regime. It was not possible from the internal forces. There is a civil war going on in Syria today. It is clear that both sides have a base among the population. It's not clear what the proportions of the base are, but there's no question. The contention that, that it's the people against the government, which has been the standard presentation, and was the presentation in regard to Libya, is a completely false presentation. And it has to be said that there's no form of warfare that is more brutal than civil war. In U.S. history, where the sides were separated to a large degree, not completely, but to a large degree, the Civil War is the war with the largest number of casualties. I believe more than World War I and World War II combined, the U.S. deaths in the Civil War, at the time when the population was much smaller than it was at the time of either World War I or World War II. It is said by the United Nations, whose U.S. selected Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, has openly demanded, openly taken a side in this and openly demanded the overthrow of the Syrian government. The UN says that more than 15,000 people have died in the fighting in Syria. The Syrian government says that several thousand of its soldiers and other security personnel have been killed. There have been many bombings in the capital Damascus and other cities which bear the mark of Al-Qaeda. I'm not saying that Al-Qaeda started this. That's, I don't think, an accurate presentation. But there's no question that they have entered it, and they are, and the United States are on the same side in what's going on there. Civil wars are even more brutal if they become sectarian civil wars. Sectarian based either on national or religious basis, where and particularly if the populations are very intermingled, as was the case in the former Yugoslavia and in Iraq. In both cases, the U.S. policy was to favor, support, and aid certain national or religious groups, which led to the worst sort of warfare, designed to drive other national or ethnic or religious groups out of the territory. You know, I mean, this is something that, again, this is not a topic for any discussion in any of the corporate media, or even very often in any progressive media. In Iraq, this policy by the United States, this deliberate policy, which is just a continuation of that thing that I read about France in 1925, the division, the divide and conquer policy. In Iraq, it led to hundreds of thousands of people being killed since 2003, and more than 4.5 million Iraqis out of a population of about 26 million being forced into either internal or external exile. I mean, this is what the product was. And the product in Yugoslavia, you know, where there was a lot of intermarriage, as in Iraq, between different groups. They're not all this myth about everybody's living in their own little enclaves. That's completely false. So again, this was largely a product, in both Iraq and Yugoslavia, of a U.S. policy which is very similar to the earlier colonial policies, most perfected probably by the British, of pitting one group against another. And then, of course, the colonizers turn around and they cluck their tongues and talk about how awful this all is. What is absolutely clear is that world imperialism, led by the U.S. and its client regimes in the Middle East, are supporting one side in the conflict. And the U.S. aims have nothing to do with their ostensible claims, their claims about concern for human rights and democracy. That's really just to round up public opinion here. There's no other purpose for it. They, of course, always have to do that. They have to make their interventions appear to be for some noble purpose. They can't tell the truth to the public. They can't say, well, we're trying to gain complete domination of the Middle East because of its strategic position and its vast oil reserves as a key element in our strategy for global domination. That's not all that appealing a motivation to people to, you know, appropriate hundreds of billions of dollars, send young people halfway around the world to fight and kill and die. So we get the noble presentation. The U.S. leaders and their media would have us believe also that the, quote, international community is all on one side in this struggle. In fact, because so much of the international community is not, to the extent that there is any such thing as an international community in a class-divided world, which I don't really think there is, but because the People's Republic of China and Russia and other countries are really against what the U.S. project is, then they're not really part of the international community anymore. You know, they're outside of it. So that's a big problem. That's one of the big problems for the U.S. is the fact that there are major powers which have not capitulated to them at this point. But it's not just those two countries of China and Russia. If you watch the corporate media, you would think that Turkey is leading the charge against Syria, right? There's a lot of news about Turkey, which we almost never hear any news about Turkey. I mean, you know, now that they're doing something that Washington approves of, we hear a lot about Turkey in the media. And the Turkish government, which has its own aspirations, it's not just a puppet, it has its own aspirations to dominate in the region, is carrying out its policy. But there was a recent article in the PSL's Liberation News website by Tayfun Gol that talked about an opinion poll that was recently published by the Ankara Social Research Center in Turkey, which revealed that more than 2/3 of the Turkish people polled oppose any intervention in Syria by Turkey, by their government. The Communist Party of Turkey, the article continued, released a statement condemning the government, calling the jet incident, where the Turkish jet was shot down, a one of many government provocations against Syria, adding that this reconnaissance operation on behalf of the U.S. and Israel cannot be covered up with the rhetoric of quote-unquote national unity. The statement also demanded Erdogan, the prime minister's, resignation. And in April, a peace march organized by the Turkish Communist Party against imperialist intervention was repressed when the Turkish police blocked activists from traveling to a Turkish city on the Syrian border. I don't think this was reported, any of this has been reported in the media. Has anybody seen this in any media at all? Well, it should not be surprising to anyone that the Turkish population overwhelmingly opposes any form of intervention in Syria. With a NATO-backed military coup in 1980 that jailed over 100,000 people in Turkey, torturing and killing many for organizing and standing against imperialism. And, you know, Turkey is home to key U.S. and NATO military bases. It would, in fact, to the extent that it would be safe to say that Turkey is also under NATO occupation. For us, I'll just conclude by saying that for us here, the main task is to oppose what our imperialist government is doing, and to demand an end to all forms of intervention in Syria, the sanctions against Iran, the sanctions against any country. There's an article saying, that was on the chair saying, how come there's not sanctions against the United States with its long bloody history? We stand for self-determination and the right of the Syrian people to resolve this conflict, and say that the U.S. and NATO, hands off Syria and out of the Middle East.